You discuss justice on the steps of the courtroom. You discuss love in the drinking party. You discuss seduction outside the city walls at night when you can hear the cicadas.
Philosophy has to also have this location. It can't just be taking place at bus stations with schizophrenics, to be honest. It has to be taking place also at the highest levels of society so that the people who are running society are able to make good decisions.
But most people are not cut out for it. Most people are not capable of doing it at any meaningful level for very long at all. And most importantly, most people hate it when they encounter it.
It's very obvious that in the different dialogues, they take place all over the place, including outside the city in Phaedrus, where the question of rhetoric, seduction, poetry, and so on is discussed. And there's a time and a place, let's put it that way. There might be for different types of conversation, right? The symposium, we know, is the drinking party where they discuss love and so on and so forth. So I think the attention to detail, like the topoi or whatever you want to say, is absolutely crucial. Like you discuss justice on the steps of the courtroom. You discuss love in the drinking party. You discuss seduction outside the city walls at night when you can hear the cicadas. Like this is very, very precise, very, very beautiful way of making this point, I think. And I think this point about speaking to everybody everywhere, right? The only thing that limits dialogue is the fact of our own death, if you see what I mean, the fact that we have limited time, right? Or we're separated from somebody else. Of course, the face-to-face dialogue is the preferable one, right? Like this is this whole question of being present. You know, this idea that Derrida takes up, this thing about presence. You know, because the shift from the oral to the writing tradition is the shift from the being together, the being present, to the written word, which can be disseminated at distance. You can hear voices. It introduces this kind of cultural schizophrenia into the Greeks, which they deal with tragedy. It's a tragic world where you don't have tragedy to cope with the technology. But yeah, I think if you're not afraid to die, then you actually do have all the time in the world. If you see what I mean, because you're not worried about it, right? So, like, I had a conversation with a woman at the bus stop the other day for an hour about the fact that she was going to get the bus to Bristol to feed the pigeons by the bus station, and that was why she was traveling to Bristol. And then she was telling me about how McDonald's basically put kidnapped children in their hamburgers and so on. And we were having this whole conversation about meat production and the elites and pigeons, and it was wonderful. If you see what I mean. And she was so happy to have this conversation and to be listened to and so on. So in principle, we can talk about anything with everyone. But if we can be more poetic and have the right conversation in the right place, then it's even more beautiful.
I love all of that and agree with all of it completely. It's a very Christian idea to say it all, leave it all out there. And if that means they kill you, so be it. I completely agree that is kind of the highest way to think and the highest way to live. And I think you're all completely right about that. How do you think
I don't agree, by the way. I don't agree with this. I don't think this is exactly, I don't think this is Plato's position. I think that also...
I don't think it's Plato's position, but go on.
No. Well, I mean, Plato says, of course, you know, he hangs at the entrance of the academy the sign that says, let no one who is not a geometer enter here. I mean, essentially, the possibility of engaging in philosophical dialogue is not universally distributed. It's not even just a question of capacity. It's also a question of desire, the desire of one's interlocutor to engage in dialogue, their desire and their ability. These things, of course, are connected to some extent. But I think it's interesting also to consider, again, Thrasymachus's position here. I mean, Socrates obviously does engage in dialogue with him. Thrasymachus is very reluctant to engage in dialogue with Socrates. He's quite petulant, actually. You know, he goes along with Socrates, also himself under duress, actually, kind of protesting all the time. And, you know, in the end, the dialogue is not really a dialogue between, let's say, equal partners, because the way in which Thrasymachus conducts it is somehow directed not exactly towards, let's say, the good itself. To some extent it is, because Socrates sort of forces him onto that path. But basically Thrasymachus kind of wants to be right about what he's saying, you know. And I think that you have this phenomenon quite generally distributed. And I think one can get a little bit led astray by sort of somehow identifying too strongly with this kind of universalism of philosophy in the context of, let's say, a kind of universal democracy. I think the point is that philosophy does have this universalist position within society. The reason why philosophical dialogues also have to happen in the houses of people like Cephalus is not for the sake of the philosopher. It's actually for the sake of the city. It's for the sake of the city that philosophy has to also have this location. It can't just be taking place at bus stations with schizophrenics, to be honest. Like, it has to be taking place, also at the highest levels of society, so that the people who are running society are able to make good decisions because they have sound mind, and they are then able to make judgments on that basis. And of course, this is also the basis, we can say, of a certain kind of Platonic critique of whatever society we have now.
Okay, I admit that my democratic, universal, Christian, St. Francis of Assisi, let's talk to the birds position is not Plato's position. I'm not claiming it is. But I do think there is actually a relationship between the schizophrenia of the woman at the bus stop and the madness of leaders, right? And actually, I do think that the dialogue is on a continuum, right? And that if everybody was... I don't know how to put it, right? Okay, of course, there are only going to be a certain numbers of guardians. Of course, it takes 40 years to train. You have to know mathematics, gymnastics, music. You have to appreciate internally the order of the universe. You have to have these limit experiences of body and mind, which render you capable of understanding the order and harmony and balance of the universe, right? Of course, we know this. It's not for everybody. Not everybody is going to be physically and mentally and spiritually strong enough to do this. Right. But I think that everybody can participate to some degree in these capacities. And I think that the fundamental philosophical virtue, which also everybody can share as a citizen, is courage. Right. And this is the courage to stand up to bullies, whether it's someone who's bullying you at work, the courage to stand up to bad ideas. We're now overrun by bad ideas because, really, really insane people have been allowed to make claims and threaten people with these crazy ideas, and this is a pathocracy. This is what is being discussed in the Ponerology book by Lobachevsky. And so I think there is a kind of continuum of philosophy in which everybody can participate to some degree.
Well, again, I must dispute that. I think that, at least from the point of view of what Plato is saying in the Republic, I mean, when he articulates the different classes of personages who will inhabit the city, he does it quite strictly based on an understanding that indeed capacities are not universally or even evenly distributed. The participation of people, for example, like shoemakers in Plato's city in philosophy, is not because they're directly participating in philosophy. It's because the city is well run. In other words, because the city is just, everyone participates in justice. But that doesn't actually mean that everybody is participating in philosophical discussions. And in fact, Socrates is quite clear on this point, or at least Plato's Socrates, because Socrates himself, I think, maybe was not so clear on it, and that, of course, had its own consequences. But he says that, in fact, people should remain within their classes, as it were. In other words, the guardians should do guardian stuff, the shoemakers should do shoemaker stuff, the money makers should do money making stuff, and people shouldn't get confused about these things, because actually, when that happens, that's when you start to get the production of injustice, because the city is no longer being properly organized. So I would say attempting to sort of universally mobilize a kind of philosophical mass is, I mean, this is ultimately, somehow I would say Marxist proposition, but this is not the classical Greek proposition. The classical Greek proposition is we properly train the philosophers through, Socrates says in this case, gymnastics and music, basically, so that they have the correct spirit, so that they're able to administer justice in the city, and then everyone benefits from justice. That's the role of philosophy, not simply spreading philosophy, ideologically through the body of society.
Okay, even if we accept the kind of gold, silver, bronze souls, the kind of class, caste hierarchy, the training and the differential capacity, I mean, which is objectively true. Like, difference is what there is, right? Like, we're all different. We're different ages apart from anything else. You know, we all have different whatever skills and capabilities. But I think that the fundamental desire to talk and to ask questions, for example, will happen to everybody. You know, is there a God? What is love? How should I live? Right. These are moral questions. These are questions that are existential. They're philosophical. Okay, we might say that certain religions have an answer. Okay, and then we're talking about the relationship between an exoteric set of rules and an esoteric set of rules, right? So we might say, look, for different castes, for different classes, there may need to be different rules, right? There might need to be different norms, and there might need to be different morals, right? If you say to everybody, as liberalism does, oh, follow your desire, right? You can do and be whatever you want. I mean, this is fundamentally chaotic, right? This is an incredibly bad imperative. It's extremely destructive. We can see our cities are overrun by drug abuse and so on. I mean, you know, not to mention the sexual impulses run wild. So, look, the relationship, I think, between the order of a society and its human composition, right? Of course, this is what Plato is talking about. But I think a kind of rounded, ordered, beautiful life will also have time and respect for the shoemaker's question. You know, how should I live? How best should I live? What is love? What is justice? Right? These are questions that occur to everybody at a certain point in response to life events, encounters, and so on. And I can't say that that's not philosophy. That is philosophy to me. And I do think that Socrates, precisely by corrupting the youth, remember, Socrates is accused of fundamentally misleading young men, right? So there is a class, whatever class Socrates is from, we can talk about Socrates's class, spiritually speaking or materially speaking. There is always a question of this cross-class, how can we put it? Interaction, right? Or contamination, even. You know, the rich man who picks up his shoes at the shoemaker's shop, the poorer guy, the worker says to the rich man, you know, how do you feel about your life, or what makes you happy, right? Is that a philosophical interaction?
Well, I think that you making a big assumption when you say that the shoemaker is concerned with the question of justice. I think the way that he approaches that question actually is a little bit different than the way a philosopher approaches this question. I think the question of justice for the shoemaker is, how do I make good shoes, basically? And that's, by the way, like a perfectly honorable way of approaching this question. I don't think necessarily, although of course, ironically, we do have many examples of very metaphysical shoemakers in history, but I don't think the shoemaker is necessarily interested in or wants to be or let's say even should be compelled to become an existentialist philosopher. I think actually it's better if they're focusing their capacity for the good on their own métier. And I think this is you know, the position that you're articulating is most anti-Platonic, actually, in its implications,
but
if I may say
Daniel,
so.
man is not a machine, right? Man is not a machine, right? Even if you reduce a person to their function, right? You are a masseuse, you are a shoemaker, you are a teacher, whatever, right? Like that does not like exceed the bounds of somebody's capacity or their humanity, right? Or it doesn't encapsulate it, if you see what I mean, right? Late at night, like the person who's stacking shelves, who's putting things in baskets to be delivered by some person on £4.50 an hour who rides a bike around the city, right? Are these people, like, when they're having thoughts about their lives? I'm not saying that people must be compelled to philosophize, by the way, right? It's not a kind of imperative in that sense. I'm saying that it's a natural feature of existence and being alive. Because man is not a machine. The moment we reduce man to a machine, then we are talking about slavery, which perhaps we should talk about.
But this is not. This is again not Plato's perspective. I mean, he talks specifically about techne. So ultimately, the philosophical techne is one techne. The shoemaking techne is another techne. Excellence in one's techne is entirely dignified. It's not about being a machine. It's about actually applying your capacities to your craft in order to produce excellent shoes, which is a very fulfilling thing to do. You're saying that for some reason there's philosophical techne, which everybody has, which I think is A, not true, B, not true, and C, also not true. I think it's actually delusional to say this, and very dangerous, because it then actually leads you to the point where you have, people who don't really have the craft of philosophizing, engaging in forms of philosophy. And what they produce is actually not philosophy. They produce things that are sort of almost like it's monstrous caricatures, really. And I think this is also what we have as a consequence of a certain kind of, ill-founded democratic universalism with respect to these kinds of abstractions that actually, should probably remain in the academy as opposed to sort of wandering through the world like hell.
Well, so look, there's a synthesis here. I think you're both right, and it's reflected in the fact that this Greek concept of parousia, their sense of radical free speech as they understood it, this word parousia was used both in a positive sense and in a negative sense. There were just basically two meanings of this word. It could be a noble activity that thoughtful philosophers engage in at great risk to their own life when they speak freely in public and they say things that are dangerous and that are generally prohibited, that they could lose their life for saying. That's a noble kind of parousia, which was well understood as noble. But parousia was also the word that was used to describe the meaningless democratic chatter of a confused and degenerate city. So the same exact word was used to describe both noble, courageous, virtuous free speech and also meaningless, wasteful nonsense spoken by kind of deluded schizophrenics in the public square, right? So you're both right. And I think the synthesis here really is that basically it's like philosophy is this universalist calling. It is, in fact, something that everyone can relate to in some degree somehow. Like at some point in everyone's life, they've sort of had an encounter with sort of the radical possibility of human thought and of thinking and speaking fully. But most people are not cut out for it. Most people are not capable of doing it at any meaningful level for very long at all. And most importantly, Nina, most people hate it when they encounter it. It is simply the case that you start talking to the shoemaker about, the philosophies of justice, and in general, they'll be annoyed. But then sooner or later, they will actually want to kill you if you go on long enough and you kind of fully explain what all this stuff involves. This is certainly encoded in the Socratic texts, and I think we see it today, right? We see it amply today. Like people talk about free speech, people say they want a kind of robust, interesting public culture, and everywhere you look, if you actually are saying anything that's prohibited, people will file lawsuits and so on, right? So I think the real synthesis comes with Christianity, frankly. Like even Christ himself, who's willing to pay the ultimate, God comes down to earth and is willing to pay the ultimate price for speaking freely. Even Christ, you read the Gospels carefully, he's also dodging bullets, like sometimes, the mob comes for him and he's like, all right, I'm out of here for now. He says, my hour has not come yet. I'm not going to let these people hang me right now. He's not afraid of being hung. He's not afraid of being killed, which he knows that he will be killed. But that doesn't mean that he needs to go and be killed at all times. And that he needs to sort of naively submit to the lynching of the mob at all times in all places. So even Christ himself engages in a kind of political logic of some kind where, he may occasionally sort of hide from power in a sense. So that to me is the synthesis. The synthesis is, the philosopher is called to speak the truth fully and freely, and the philosopher aims to do so to his or her greatest ability, but also while trying to navigate different social subspaces and social contexts gracefully in a way that is pleasing and beautiful, and where you're not rushing into your death naively, unnecessarily, but you're ready for death when it comes, and it surely will.